My parents skipped my wedding because I married before my perfect sister. Now their perfect family image is finally crumbling. Before I continue, subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay updated with shocking, weird, and unbelievable real-life stories happening around you. The air smelled like jasmine from the garden where I was about to say, I do. The venue was a hidden paradise, lush greenery surrounding us, soft petals scattered across the ground as if the earth itself had prepared for this moment. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life. And in many ways, it was. But there was one obvious absence that tainted the joy. My parents and my younger sister, Hannah, didn't come. At 32, after 4 years of being with the man I loved deeply, I married him in a simple garden ceremony surrounded by friends and loved ones. The sun bathed the entire scene in golden light, and the sound of soft laughter and joyful whispers filled the air. Everyone was there, except for the 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It wasn't a surprise. They had made it clear where they stood long before the invitations were even sent. Their absence was like a wound in the center of my chest, a hollow ache I could no longer ignore. I stood at the altar, the warmth of my husband's hand in mine, his touch grounding me in the present, but my mind kept drifting to the empty seats in the front row, reserved for my parents. I had expected this. In fact, I had prepared myself for it. But that didn't make the hurt any less painful. I had always tried to convince myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need them, but in that moment, it felt like I was incomplete, standing there without the people who had shaped me, who should have been there to witness this new chapter of my life. My husband, Lucas, squeezed my hand as the officiant began the ceremony. His warm smile anchored me, reminding me that while I lacked the support I had always longed for, I was surrounded by people who truly cared. I glanced around at the guests, their faces radiating genuine happiness. But my heart ached for what I never had, the acceptance, the acknowledgement, the simple act of being seen by the ones who should have loved me the most. Growing up, I had always felt like a background character in my own family. Hannah, 2 years younger than me, was the golden child. It wasn't hard to see why. She was everything my parents had ever wanted in a daughter. Beautiful, smart, charming, and ambitious. She commanded attention in every room she walked into. People adored her, and so did my parents, perhaps too much. They showered her with praise and opportunities, while I was quietly pushed aside, like a forgotten second fiddle. I never minded the little things at first. Her getting the bigger slice of cake, her school projects hanging proudly on the fridge while mine were tucked away in a drawer. But it became harder to ignore as we grew older. Hannah was always the star of the family, the one who earned my parents' affection, while I learned how to shrink myself to avoid the discomfort of their indifference. The more they praised her, the more I faded into the background. I remember the time when Hannah won a national art competition. My parents threw a lavish party to celebrate her success. There was no mention of my accomplishments, no acknowledgement of the things I had done or the battles I had fought. They were too busy planning her next step, her next audition, her next big opportunity, to even ask about me. I sat in the corner of the room, surrounded by guests who praised Hannah, not knowing that the only thing I wanted was to be seen, to be recognized, even just for a moment. When my acceptance letter to the university came through for my computer science degree, I was excited. It was an accomplishment I had worked tirelessly for, sacrificing so much to get there. But when I told my parents, they barely even looked up from their phones. My mother offered a vague congratulations, and my father sent a quick, well done via text. I had hoped for something more, something to acknowledge the hard work I had put in, but all I got was silence. Instead, a week later, they threw a lavish dinner for Hannah's new job promotion. I couldn't stop the tears that night, but I also couldn't stop the realization that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. I remember the day I graduated with my degree in computer science. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life, but as usual, my family had other plans. I stood there in my cap and gown, surrounded by friends who were proud of me, but my parents? They didn't show up. The day was still memorable, of course. Lucas was there, beaming with pride, and so was his family. But the absence of my parents was like a silent slap to my face. It wasn't even the first time this had happened. They'd missed my high school graduation too, and I had convinced myself that it didn't matter, that I didn't need their validation. But in that moment, standing alone, it was impossible to ignore. Instead of celebrating me, my mother had spent the day with Hannah, planning another one of her extravagant social events. "Hannah, you need to wear this dress for the gala next week." It will make you look more refined. She had texted Hannah hours before my ceremony. I was angry, yes, but even more so, I was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of working so hard only to be met with indifference. Lucas noticed the shift in my mood immediately. He knew the weight I carried in my heart, the constant ache of yearning for my parents' approval. He pulled me aside after the ceremony, away from the crowd. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, wrapping his arms around me. "You've worked so hard. This is your moment. Let's celebrate it." But even his words, as comforting as they were, couldn't fill the hole that my parents' absence had left behind. Growing up, my mother had always made sure to remind me of my shortcomings, of how I was too big or too plain. My body was never enough. I was shorter than Hannah, broader in the shoulders, thicker around the waist. In her eyes, these were flaws that needed to be fixed. I remember one particular afternoon when I was 12. We were at the mall, and my mother insisted we stop by a store she had picked out. "Try this on," she told me, thrusting a tight-fitting dress into my hands. "It will make you look less heavy." I stood in front of the mirror in that dressing room, staring at the reflection of the girl I had always been, and felt nothing but shame. The dress was tight, the fabric clinging to me in a way that made me feel suffocated. I pulled it off quickly and changed back into my regular clothes. I didn't want to be judged anymore, but somehow, it always seemed inevitable. It wasn't just that day. It was years of subtle, sometimes not so subtle, remarks. My mother insisted I sign up for fitness classes, signing me up for diet plans and fitness routines, without even asking what I wanted. She made comments about my appearance in front of relatives, pointing out how much better Hannah looked in her clothes, how she effortlessly pulled off the latest trends. Meanwhile, I was made to feel like I was always a step behind, always a work in progress. As the years passed, I internalized the message. No matter what I did, I would never be good enough. The more I tried to change myself for their approval, the more I realized that nothing ever truly satisfied them. There was no magic number on the scale that would make me worthy in their eyes. I grew resentful of the mirror, of the way my body was used as a point of comparison. It wasn't until I met Lucas that I began to see myself differently, through eyes that didn't see imperfections but saw a woman who was whole, who was enough just as she was. It took years of trying to please them before I finally gave up. After high school, I went off to university, determined to prove myself. But every step I took, every new achievement, was met with cold indifference. Even when I earned my first promotion at work, I barely got a congratulations. The phone call I received from my mother was brief, her voice distant as always. "Good for you, I guess. But Hannah's still got it better, doesn't she?" It was in that moment that something inside me finally snapped. I realized that no matter how much I accomplished, I would never earn their approval. There was always someone better, always someone who could do things in a way that met their expectations. I would always be second to Hannah, always be the one they overlooked. I stopped trying. I stopped reaching out, stopped sharing my accomplishments. And the silence from them grew louder, more deafening. But I also began to breathe easier. I realized that I didn't need their approval to be successful or happy. For the first time, I could finally hear myself again, my own voice rising above the noise they had always created. But it wasn't without pain. Then there was Lucas. He came into my life at a time when I had given up on trying to be anything other than myself. We met at a tech conference. He was presenting a talk on data security, and I was there just to observe. But the moment we started talking, something clicked. He wasn't interested in my appearance, my weight, or my resume. He was intrigued by my mind, by the way I spoke about technology, the passion I had for coding. He saw something in me that I had long since stopped seeing in myself: potential, strength, beauty in who I was. That night, we stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. It was effortless, comfortable. When we parted ways, I felt like I had known him for years. We exchanged numbers, and from that moment on, everything started to change. He made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way that no one ever had before. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I didn't need to change for anyone. For years passed, and Lucas and I were inseparable. We were the kind of couple that everyone envied, not because we were perfect, but because we worked, because we understood each other in a way no one else could. Then one night, as we sat on the couch, binge-watching our favorite series and eating takeout, Lucas turned to me with a look of quiet certainty. "Rebecca," he said, holding a small velvet box in his hand, "will you marry me?" I was stunned. In all the time we had spent together, I never once expected him to propose this way. There were no grand gestures, no fireworks. Just him, me, and a beautiful moment. I said yes, of course. We laughed, hugged, and kissed like we had won a great victory. For once, I felt like the world was right, like everything I had been through had led me to this moment with him. But when I told my parents about our engagement, I expected something, anything, but they were indifferent. My mother didn't even raise an eyebrow when I shared the news. "That's nice," she said with a cold tone, her attention already shifting back to her own thoughts. My father didn't say a word. It wasn't even the initial excitement I had hoped for. It was like I had given them a mere update. I wasn't looking for a lavish celebration or a grand party, but at least some acknowledgement that I mattered. But no, not even that. They barely acknowledged the news. Meanwhile, my mother was already posting on Facebook about Hannah's latest achievements, completely ignoring the fact that her oldest daughter was getting married. Lucas could see the hurt in my eyes when I shared how they reacted. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "That's not right. You deserve better." The wedding planning process was an overwhelming blur of decisions, excitement, and stress. I had no one to lean on in my family. There was no mother to help me pick out a dress, no father to walk me down the aisle. But I had Lucas, and that was more than enough. His family was there to support me, just as my friends were, and we made our plans together. There was a bittersweetness to every choice. The cake, the flowers, the venue. I knew they would all be beautiful, but there was always a quiet ache in my heart, the absence of the family who was supposed to care the most. The day arrived, and as I stood in front of the mirror, slipping into my dress, I felt a weight settle in my chest. But there was also peace. Lucas was waiting for me, and I was ready to marry him. The people who truly loved me were there, and that was enough. After the wedding, we went on a honeymoon, a blissful escape to a tropical island. It was the perfect break, just the two of us, basking in the warmth of the sun and the intimacy of our newlywed life. But as we returned to reality, the absence of my parents still ached. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a few days after we got back when I decided to call them. I had to know why they hadn't come, why they had chosen not to support me. The phone rang, and when my mother picked up, her voice was as flat as ever. "Mom, why didn't you come to the wedding?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "We had no issues, no misunderstandings. Why didn't you show up?" Her response was almost too rehearsed. "We never got a formal invitation," she said, almost like it was an excuse. "We weren't sure if we were really welcome." It was laughable. I had sent them invitations, called them, and told them the details. But no, they hadn't shown up. They hadn't even bothered to let me know they wouldn't be coming. I felt betrayed, rejected, but oddly calm at the same time. It was clear to me now. This wasn't about an invitation. This was about their inability to be there for me, their refusal to support my happiness. The next conversation was even worse. I called my father, hoping for some kind of explanation, but when he spoke, his voice was calm. "Maybe it's time for us to stop pretending that we're bad parents, since you've already made up your mind that we are," he said with almost a dismissive tone. My heart dropped. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of my hurt. Instead, it felt like an accusation, like I was the one who had done something wrong by simply expecting them to care. And then my mother chimed in. "Maybe you just couldn't handle not being the center of attention." It hit me like a slap in the face. For years, I had been invisible in that house, ignored, undervalued, and now, after everything, I was being accused of stealing the spotlight. It was laughable, in a way, but it was also deeply painful. I didn't argue. There was no point. I knew that no matter what I said, it would never make a difference. Their refusal to see me, to understand me, spoke volumes. I didn't fight back. I didn't beg for an apology. There was no point. It became clear to me that no amount of words would ever change their perspective. It wasn't about me. It was about their image of me. I had spent years chasing after their approval, but now I was done. For the first time in my life, I went without apologizing, without explaining myself. I ended the call and sat in silence for a long time, immersed in deep thoughts. As the days passed, the silence between me and my family stretched longer. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of freedom I hadn't felt before. For so long, I had lived in the shadows of their expectations, their judgments, and their indifference. I had allowed their absence to define me, to make me feel small and unworthy. But now I was free from that. The girl who had spent years longing for approval, for validation, was gone. And in her place stood a woman who had learned to breathe without their suffocating demands. I could finally hear my own voice clearly, without the constant noise of their expectations. One night, I sat on the porch with Lucas, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of crickets. Lucas held my hand, his touch grounding me. I looked at him and asked the question I had been too afraid to voice for years. Do you think I'm a bad person for wanting them to be there for me? For wanting them to love me? He squeezed my hand, his eyes soft with understanding. No, Rebecca. You're not bad. You're human. It's okay to want that from them. But you've given them so much, and it's time to stop giving pieces of yourself to people who can't see your worth. His words lingered in the air, and I felt a deep peace. They weren't coming. They hadn't come for me before, and they wouldn't come for me now. But I had something more valuable, his love, the love of my friends, and the support of people who chose me, who didn't make me feel like I'm second to someone. It wasn't an overnight change, but gradually, I began to feel lighter. I stopped waking up in the mornings hoping for a call from my mother, or a message from my father, or a surprise visit from Hannah. They didn't define my happiness anymore. I was no longer waiting for their approval to feel like I was enough. That evening, I sat with Lucas. We were talking about the future, about the family we hoped to build together. I wasn't bound by the chains of past rejection anymore. I could finally envision a future where my happiness didn't rely on people who couldn't even show up when it mattered most. I asked Lucas again, this time with more certainty. Do you think I've changed? He nodded, his voice steady. You have, Rebecca. And it's beautiful to watch. You've let go of something that was holding you back. And now you're free. It felt like a revelation, and in a way it was. For so long, I had thought that I needed their love to feel whole. But now I knew that my worth wasn't tied to them. It was tied to me. And that realization was the most liberating thing I had ever experienced. The woman who had once begged for validation no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone who stood firm in her own identity. Someone who had learned to love herself, imperfections and all. I wasn't perfect. I wasn't always confident, and I still had moments where I missed my family. But I no longer sought their approval as the key to my happiness. I had learned to find peace within myself, to trust in my own worth. It wasn't long before Hannah reached out. I had expected it. She was always the one who found a way to insert herself into the chaos, to try to smooth things over in her own manipulative way. Her message came as a flood of words, each line dripping with false concern and patronizing judgment. She told me how disappointed she was in me, how I was hurting the family by airing our dirty laundry. She accused me of disrespecting our parents by making them look bad, and suggested that I was being too dramatic. It was classic Hannah, caring only about how things looked to the outside world. I read her message twice, the sting of her words no longer cutting through me like it once would have. Instead of feeling the usual wave of guilt, I felt something else, indifference. This time, I didn't respond. I didn't try to explain myself, to plead with her for understanding. I didn't have to. Without hesitation, I blocked her number. I didn't owe her an explanation. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a moment. I felt relieved. I was done. For once, I was choosing peace over family drama. I was choosing to protect my own heart. Hannah wasn't done yet, though. She refused to accept my silence. A few days later, she turned her attention to Lucas, bombarding him with messages that ranged from sweet to desperate, from manipulative to venomous. She painted herself as the victim, as the concerned sister who just wanted peace, while subtly trying to turn Lucas against me. I wasn't shocked. I had seen this side of her before, and I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. Lucas showed me the messages, and we read them together, laughing at how transparent she was. She really thinks she can play us both, huh? I said, shaking my head. Lucas smirked, his fingers tapping the phone screen. She might think she's the smartest person in the room, but I'm not her target audience. He sent a simple message back to her. Thank you for your concern about Rebecca's well-being. As her husband, I'm focused on supporting her happiness, not managing her behavior. The silence after Lucas's message was loud. Hannah didn't reply. And that was the end of it. She tried again, but the response was the same. No reply, no engagement, no power over me. It felt like a victory. Not because of the silence, but because I knew it wasn't about winning against her. It was about winning for myself. After Hannah's failed attempts, the ripple effect was swift. Family members who had long stayed silent began to speak out. The silence was finally broken. My uncle, my father's brother, was one of the first to take a stand. He called me one evening, and with a firm voice he said, "I've been watching from the sidelines for far too long," he said. "The way your parents have treated you, it's not right. And it's high time someone said something." His words hit me harder than I expected. People were starting to see the truth. My uncle wasn't alone. A few distant relatives, people who had always been quiet during family gatherings, spoke up as well. It was almost like watching a dam break, the truths flooding out into the open. My father's close friends, the ones who had witnessed the favoritism firsthand, started distancing themselves from him. The cracks in the family's facade were becoming too visible to ignore. And yet, as these truths came to light, I didn't feel joy or revenge. I felt peace. The people who had silently supported me all these years were finally finding their voices. And in their solidarity, I found strength. The truth did what I couldn't. It didn't need any grand speeches or accusations. The more my parents tried to spin the narrative, the more they exposed themselves. They had tried for years to control how the family saw them, but their grip was slipping. The truth was louder than their carefully constructed facade, and people could see it. Hannah's wedding plans started to unravel. Invitations were sent. Relatives who had always shown up for her began to pull back. It was as if the rug had been pulled from under her feet, and she was left scrambling to maintain the perfect image she had so carefully crafted. My father, ever the passive-aggressive type, began to act defensively. He made calls to family members, trying to justify his actions, trying to explain away the years of favoritism. But it was too late. People had seen the cracks, and they couldn't be unseen. Meanwhile, I remained quiet. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The truth was doing the work for me. And now, here I am, standing on the other side of it all, a little lighter, a little freer, and finally whole. I had spent so many years searching for validation from the wrong people. My parents had taught me that love was conditional, that I was only worthy of affection if I met certain standards, if I fit into a mold. But I had broken free from that mold. And in doing so, I had found something far more valuable than their approval: my own peace. The best revenge wasn't some dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It was simply living my life in the truth, finding peace, and thriving in my own happiness. I had become the person I was always meant to be, and that was more powerful than anything they could have ever given me. As the months went by, I found myself growing more confident. I no longer needed the approval of my parents or the approval of anyone who didn't truly care for me. My relationship with Lucas had deepened, and we talked more about our future, our hopes, our dreams, the family we wanted to build. And I realized something important. Love wasn't about trying to change who you are to fit someone else's expectations. It was about accepting each other as we were, flaws and all. Thank you for watching. Subscribe now if you haven't, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with shocking, weird, and unbelievable real-life stories happening around you.